Welcome back. This is part 7 of the Synagogue of Satan, Footprints in History. I just wanted to go over some of the events of the Jewish revolts in more detail and try to shed more light on just what was happening with the Jews and the Christians and with the emperors and the Roman Empire, and try to see what was driving things, and also to look at the dark halls of the elites and to see if they had a hand in causing the revolts and what they wanted. Some of the rulers may have had good intentions, but I think that mostly they did cause the revolts, and this was to increase their control over Jerusalem and also the whole Roman Empire. But I think that they made a serious mistake. I don't think they intended that the temple would be destroyed, but things got out of hand and things did not happen the way they wanted. And the families that ruled in Jerusalem lost a lot of their power and control and would seek for a long time after that to get that control back. There were some curious relationships among the ruling families. The second wife or concubine of the Emperor Nero, Poppaea Sabina, was certainly pro-Jewish, and she might have been Jewish herself. There is evidence that has come to light from her family's villas in Pompeii that they were Jewish and that they had been descended from Jewish slaves that had been brought there or into Italy as far back as the conquests of Pompey. And they had quickly received Roman citizenship, and usually the only way to do that was with a lot of money. So it is interesting how they became Roman citizens so quickly. It's a fact that Poppaea interceded for the Jews, and she was in contact with the Jewish historian Josephus, and she also was a friend of Cleopatra, the wife of Gessius Florus, the procurator of Judea. Now, was Poppaea involved with the burning of Rome and blaming Christians for it, causing the first official persecution of Christians in 64 AD? If she was a friend of the Jews, why didn't she help Christians who were considered Jews at that time? Did she have a hand in the killing of Peter and Paul, the apostles of the Christian church at that time? And being a friend of the wife of Gessius Florus, did she have a hand in getting him appointed as the procurator of Judea? Poppaea was certainly involved with the Jewish historian Josephus, who was of a priestly family. At first he had led a garrison in the revolt against Rome, but as Rome prevailed, he entered a suicide pact and killed many Jews. But when he was supposed to kill himself, he actually gave himself up to the Emperor Vespasian and became a servant of Vespasian for the rest of his life. If any one man could be said to have been the cause of the Jewish revolt of 66 AD, it was certainly the Roman procurator of Judea, Gessius Florus. He was the one that entered the temple at Jerusalem and took money out of the treasury, falsely claiming it was for the Roman emperor. And he committed several other atrocities openly, while other leaders had tried to hide their atrocities. And it's even possible that he was Jewish. Was he trying to cause the revolt? And if he was a Jew, why was he committing atrocities against other Jews? To cause a revolt? According to one account, rebels had taken over part of Jerusalem, and King Herod Agrippa sent his cavalry in to try to restore order, but in the process the archives were burned down. This was blamed on the rebels, claiming they were trying to incite others to revolt. But was it actually Herod that burned down the archives? What was in the archives that he would want to conceal? Was he trying to hide his Edomite ancestry? But Edomites could actually be included with the nation of Israel after 3 generations according to Jewish law. It may be that he was trying to destroy records of the tribes of Israel, especially the ruling line of David and also Jesus' bloodline. But there were also other records he might have been trying to destroy, like records of ruling families of Jerusalem. There were many old families that had questionable origins, like the Tobiads. Some claim it was the Romans that destroyed the archives for the same reasons. Vespasian would use Josephus to write a history of the Jewish wars, and Josephus actually believed that Vespasian was the Messiah of the Jews. Vespasian imposed a tax as a penalty on all Jews to pay for the Jewish wars, and this would replace the tithes that Jews normally paid to the temple at Jerusalem, and the funds would be redirected to the temple of Jupiter at Rome. The tax, called the Fiscus Judaicus, was collected mostly by the Jews of Alexandria, Egypt, the second largest city in the Roman Empire and possibly the world, and only those that abandoned the Jewish customs were exempt from the tax. Vespasian needed a lot of money to maintain his armies, and he also wanted peace, so he didn't persecute the Christians, possibly because they didn't partake in the Jewish revolt, and he also allowed the synagogues and the Pharisees to continue practicing because they were considered pacifists. Vespasian and his son Titus would use treasures taken from the temple in Jerusalem to fund the building of the Colosseum in Rome, and they would use this as propaganda against the Jews to secure their positions as emperors. It's also curious that Titus became involved with Bernice, the sister of King Herod Agrippa, and she was also the granddaughter of Herod the Great. Titus actually wanted to marry her, but this was forbidden by Vespasian. Christians petitioned Vespasian to be considered a distinct sect from Judaism, possibly so that they could be exempt from the tax. And also Simon, Bishop of Jerusalem, petitioned Vespasian to allow Christians to return to Palestine and Jerusalem after the revolt ended in 74 AD. Domitian, the son of Vespasian, actually changed the tax after he became emperor. He broadened the tax to include anyone practicing anything like Jewish customs and anyone living what was called a Jewish life. And in the process, Vespasian's nephew Titus Flavius Clemens was martyred for living a so-called Jewish life. There was a big problem because there were many philosophical sects that had similar customs to the Jewish customs, and there was also a problem with widespread blackmail. Anybody could easily come up with accusations against someone for practicing Jewish customs, but it was very hard to disprove, so there were many large settlements made out of court to eliminate the accusations. So there were many martyrs during the reign of Domitian because many didn't have the money to pay to be exonerated, and they died because they refused to sacrifice to the emperor as a god to prove their loyalty to Rome. The tax was changed again by Emperor Nerva so that only those openly practicing Jewish customs were liable for the tax. But this was a problem for many Christians because if they didn't openly observe Jewish customs, they would no longer be a recognized religion, losing their legal status. Now you can see how this might be a problem for a Christian slave because they might not have the money to pay the tax if they were accused by someone. But slaves were rather unimportant, and since they didn't have much money, there wouldn't be much reason to blackmail them either. It would be more of a problem for Jewish Christians because they were still observing Jewish customs, but Gentiles that had converted to the Christian church would not be required to observe Jewish customs, so they might get out of the problem. But Christians had lost their Roman citizenship, so a Roman citizen could legally do anything they wanted to a Christian. The biggest problem for individuals was those in positions of power and influence. They were big targets for blackmail, and to keep their positions, they would surely have to show their allegiance to Rome, so that would involve paying some kind of worship to the emperors. Any immoral person could infiltrate a secret worship service, and they could target any prominent Jewish Christian or Gentile Christian, and they would either have to face death for not sacrificing to the emperor as a god, or not paying the tax for openly practicing Jewish customs, or they would pay some large blackmail. Now the biggest problem for the Roman emperors and the ruling classes was the army, and also skilled craftsmen. They needed the army for support and to control their empire, and they needed the craftsmen to function. A common slave might revolt against their owner if they didn't like their conditions, but they also might revolt if they were asked to do something against their faith, like commit a crime or have sex with their owner. But the Roman rulers were mostly concerned with the army and the militant forces. They absolutely had to have them for control. Soldiers were constantly faced with the possibility of death, so cults that offered them eternal life or some sort of salvation were very popular, and this is why the Christian faith especially grew among soldiers. But also the cult of Mithra grew because it also had a doctrine of salvation and a form of eternal life. So there was a competition between the cult of Mithra and also Christianity. Many in the upper classes were undoubtedly practicing the cult of Mithra in their religion, but the standard Roman religion was still the accepted religion for the masses. But some of the lower classes were probably getting a filtered form of the cult of Mithra, and they would practice it in secret. As long as you had the money, you could openly practice Jewish customs and just pay the tax, avoiding any death penalty for not sacrificing to the emperors. But this was a problem for Gentile Christians because they weren't necessarily practicing Jewish customs, and also Jewish Christian leaders that were trying to evangelize in Gentile lands, they could be accused of not practicing Jewish customs. The Jewish Pharisees and their converts could also afford to pay the Roman tax on Jews as long as the synagogues and the number of converts was growing. Another problem is that one could outwardly observe Jewish customs but secretly worship about anything else, and you could enter a trade guild and be promoted in that guild and openly practice Jewish customs, but secretly worship anything that you wanted. There were a lot of such trade guilds in Egypt especially. The most important trade guilds were builder guilds and also the medical professions like the Therapeutae of Egypt, which was connected with the cult of Asclepius in Pergamum. It was a problem for Christians because to be a part of a trade guild you had to swear some kind of an oath, and there was also worship of gods and the emperors. These trade guilds became infiltrated by former Sadducees and former priests of the temple at Jerusalem, and also with converts of the Pharisees. The Christian church condemned Christians being involved with trade guilds and with the mystery schools because of the oaths and the idol worship. The Christian church didn't have a problem with arts and sciences. It had a problem with the oaths and the worship of the trade guilds. Over time, the schism between Christianity and Judaism only increased, and there were many sects within both that borrowed ideas from the Greeks and other cultures, which would be called Gnosticism, and a lot of these ideas would only increase the divide. And the Christians didn't necessarily condemn Gnostic ideas. It was only when the ideas were out of context or took precedence over the worship of Jesus. So I'll continue in the next part with Gnostic ideas and different sects and how the Christian church dealt with them, and also the Zealots and what they became and their operations later. So until next time.